All right, everybody, welcome back into Cherry Picking. Today's video, draft season's right around the corner, so we're going over some draft strategies. I've got another guest alongside with me, returning guest already from this year's show, Steven Psihogios, North Star Bets digital producer, also a former Yahoo fantasy hockey contributor. Steve, how many drafts are you kind of planning on doing this year? And are you usually, typically, the leagues you're in, are you doing your drafts early, like this week? Or are you doing it like right at Canadian Thanksgiving, right before October 10th is getting started?
Good to be on, Ryan. I'm in 3 leagues. I think that's a good number for me because it's right in the middle of fantasy football season. Maybe I end up in a fantasy basketball league somehow. So I don't want to overwhelm myself, but 3 leagues, and we usually draft late. It's usually later in the season. I like later. It gives time for ADPs to kind of work themselves out. You might not get a value that you might get now in part of the season. Once everything opens up, maybe there's some players who are the ADPs are a little softer, but everything kind of works itself out. And I'm usually right before the season starts.
Yeah, I'm definitely agree with you there. I think it's just the best policy. Like there could be injuries in preseason and camp, and now guys are fully on the ice and stuff. So you want as little risk as possible because we're already betting on these players and essentially by drafting them where they currently are ranked. So we're going to be going over 4 or 5 strategies of kind of different ways you can draft your fantasy hockey team, kind of what's the best way to do it. All 4 or 5 of these strategies, I would say taking a piece from each is usually a pretty good idea. Let's just start and get into the first one. One of the first ones that I always hear, and one of the ones that I've tended to lean on a little bit, but like I say, taking just a piece of it. And if that's drafting defensemen relatively early. So in my mind, when I think about this draft strategy, I'm thinking minimum 3 defensemen by round 7. It's harder to find good defensemen later on in drafts because there's just a lot more forwards. It's just a numbers game at this point. It's kind of similar with goalies. We know we'll talk about goalies in a bit, but have you done this kind of strategy before, Steve? And have you really incorporated it in a successful fashion, or you kind of just go with like maybe best player available?
I'm more in the best player available camp. I'll keep in mind my team build while I'm drafting. Like if I go maybe 3 forwards early or 4 forwards early, I'll definitely consider a defenseman stronger in that rounds 5 through 7 range. Right now in drafts, a couple of guys who I really like where they're going at ADP. I really like Quinn Hughes, honestly. I think he is a good value right now. I was doing a mock draft today, starting to dip my toes into the fantasy hockey scene. I got him around pick 55, which I think is just a really solid value. He's going to get all the power play looks. They're not a good team defensively, Vancouver, but you really don't care about that for fantasy. He's going to get all those premium opportunities on the power play. He's going to log a ton of minutes, and there's good players around him. I also like a guy like Evan Bouchard going around pick like 75 in Yahoo drafts. I think those are 2 guys right now that I'm keeping an eye on. So I would say no. I'm not necessarily forcing it early, like with a Makar, which, is not a bad pick where he's going, or even an Adam Fox. I definitely considered him in the draft that I did right at that, round 2-3 turn. But if there's another player at another position on the board, there's no specific quota that I'll have to meet for myself in the first 7 rounds.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point in terms of looking at kind of where these defensemen rank in terms of ADP. You do have Cale Makar, who's going in the first 2 rounds, and then maybe Adam Fox, like in the 3rd round. But other than that, you really shouldn't be, I would say, reaching too far before the 4th or 5th round. I think solidifying your forwards a little bit early and then looking at some of these guys, like you mentioned, Bouchard's a good option. Quinn Hughes is a good option. Miro Heiskanen going in similar lights of those guys as well. So, and then when you're looking at bangers leagues, let's say, where you're relying a lot on hits and blocks, are you even taking a further step back of defensemen and maybe just looking at guys later on that you can get, like maybe Radko Gudas or Luke Schenn, Jeremy Lauzon on the Bruins had a ton of hits last year as well. Which kind of you're thinking there?
I think with those 2 categories in particular, like block shots and hits, those are the easiest categories to service on the waiver wire. So I'll focus a lot of my attention on getting those guys later in drafts. Like you said, you draft a Gudas maybe, or, I'm trying to think of another guy who serviced that. Like Trouba's going pretty late in drafts, Keandre Miller, those types of guys. I'll worry about those categories a little bit later because they're easier to find later in your drafts and on the waiver wire. early in drafts, I want goal scoring because you know what? There's not a whole lot of on the waiver wire. 30 plus goal scorers. Like those guys are just so hard to find that I'll load up on those types of players early in the draft. And those usually are the forwards, right? So that's why I'm not necessarily looking always for defensemen early in the draft, is because they're not the ones scoring 30 plus, 40 plus goals. You know, the forwards are. So those are the players that I'm really looking to key in on early in my draft. And later in the draft, you know, Ratko, he's not going anywhere. I don't have to worry about Ratko Gudas. Like, he's going to be there for me later. And I'll get all those hits and those block shots. And, you know, that'll take care of itself later in the draft.
Yeah, that's a good point. I agree. With bangers leagues, you definitely maybe have like a little bit more trust in knowing that those guys will be there. In just maybe points leagues where you're not really relying on hits and blocks, like it is key to get those kind of defensemen early. I would be thinking. So in that sense, in points leagues, I would go with like a minimum of 3 kind of defensemen maybe by round 7 or 8, just to make sure that that part of my team is solidified. But looking at this next kind of strategy, and I feel like this was almost adopted from fantasy football as well, kind of like the zero RB strategy, the zero goalie strategy. So I feel like now this has probably been used even more over the last 3 years than we saw in like maybe 5 or 6 years before that, because there's so many more number one goaltenders in the NHL, and now you see so many different like tandems that are playing together. So you obviously have a lot more value maybe in the later rounds. It depends a lot on your league settings, I would say as well. Like Yahoo standard scoring, saves are heavily valued in that. If you're looking at that, I think it's 0.6 per save. It's one of the reasons why Jussi Saros was the top fantasy hockey goalie last season. So what's your kind of thinking in terms of the zero goalie strategy and just goalies as a whole when you're making your fantasy hockey drafts?
It really depends. I'm usually in the camp of former goalie, but I'm not married to it. Like in the mock I did today, one guy who fell to me at the end of the 3rd round, I got him at pick 29, was Andrei Vasilevsky. And I know there's some injury concerns, like, he's coming in with some minor injuries, but I just think they're just going to give this guy rest because they know they're going to lean on him a bunch. What does he have to prove in training camp of the preseason, Vasilevsky? There's nothing. Like there's any player in the NHL who needs preseason the least, it's probably Andrei Vasilevsky. So I'm not too worried about the injury concerns, the minor injury concerns with him. And if he's going to fall because of them, I will take him early on in drafts. Like there's definitely the potential for him to be the number 1 overall goalie in fantasy hockey come the end of the year. But typically I'm waiting because you can get guys like Akira Schmid, who's on a really good team much later in a draft. You can get Stuart Skinner, another goalie on a really good team much later in the draft. Peter Kochetkov. All those guys go a lot later in your fantasy drafts. So I don't see the need, especially in a category league where wins are important. And why would you take a guy like Saros in a league where wins are a category? They're not going to win a lot of games this year, Nashville. The same goes for Connor Hellebuck. That Winnipeg team is definitely in transition. So if, in my opinion, the best strategy is the zero goalie strategy in category leagues. I can see a little bit more in points league, like you said, with saves being worth as much as they are. But in all honesty, unless one of those top guys falls to me, I'm not really looking to pull the trigger.
Yeah, that's a good point as well, because now I think in categories leagues, obviously wins are huge. And now one thing we're seeing, as I mentioned with the tandems, like I've seen a lot of people are actually doing pairing starters and backups like on a good team. Like obviously you have the perfect example of like Linus Ullmark and Jeremy Swayman. Like having both of those guys last year would have proven to be very successful. But are there any kind of tandems this year that are either new, like kind of bursting onto the scene that maybe people should be aware of, or goalie tandems from last year that maybe are going a little bit further back? Like I honestly think I love Philip Gustafson this year. I would probably hedge with like Fleury as well, just so that I get, just in case at the beginning of the year, if they are continuing to run like maybe a little bit more of a split before Gustafson starts to pull away, I would like to have that tandem. But which ones are you kind of looking at?
I'll be honest, I don't draft from the same team. I understand the reasoning for it. You're locking in that team's net mining situation, but I don't like it in the sense that you're kind of hedging against yourself. Like in a fantasy league, I'm looking more so I'll bet on a guy to do really well and emerge with that starter's job and take over the crease. Like, for example, in the Minnesota situation, I'm with you. I would take Gustafson because we've seen Fleury decline year after year, and he's really getting up there now. I think Gustafsson should be able to get a hold of that crease in Minnesota, and the Wild are going to be a pretty good team. So he'll be a good goaltender in fantasy. So to be honest with you, I'm not really looking to get just one goaltending situation shored up and just rolling with that. I'd rather try to get a guy from one team and another guy from a different team, just to avoid betting on myself. Because what happens is, for example, if you use the Wild as an example, if Gustafsson takes over their crease, you've got Fleury now, who you've used a pretty decent pick on, who's useless to you now. So to me, I'd rather just bet on one of those guys, and if I'm wrong, churn and just play the waiver wire and add, Antti Ranta. He's always there. Another guy always on waiver wire that you can scoop up or add to your situation.
Yeah, like that Kings goalie situation is obviously interesting right now. Korpisalo being moved, and then obviously there's Phoenix Copley there, and they picked up Cam Talbot. Like I like Cam Talbot this year as like a sleeper goalie because I think LA is going to be pretty good within that division. They're going to get a lot of wins, and we saw Korpisalo's numbers last year kind of get much better when he went over to LA. I just think the nature of those two teams, like Columbus, with Werenski hurt and whoever else was hurt last year, it struggled to really limit any sort of offensive opportunities from any other team. LA was the complete opposite. I think they're really deep at defense. So that's also a good thing to kind of pay attention to. And as Steve mentioned, like if you're going to do zero goalie or if you're going to draft top goalies, obviously this depends on what kind of league you're in, whether it be category or points. So definitely be paying attention to that and your league settings. One thing that I've been doing, or I did last year, that I thought really helped me, and it just because it gives you a little bit more flexibility, is drafting heavy in dual position players. So like, for example, Yahoo, in terms of top players, there's not a lot of like really good right wingers, a lot of left wingers, I would say, but it's a little bit thin at just right wingers. So, getting a guy like Matt Tkachuk, who has the left wing and right capabilities. Same with Timo Meier, Zach Hyman, Matt Boldy, all those guys, you can play on either wing, just giving you the flexibility to kind of make sure your lineup is optimized as best as possible. Is this something that you pay attention to when drafting?
Yes. Yeah, because it really does matter. Like when you get those big slates, those Saturdays, those Thursdays, sometimes a Tuesday slate, and you've got to make those tough roster decisions. Sometimes you're sitting there wishing, man, I wish that guy had right wing eligibility, because it is a thinner position. You end up putting a really good player on your bench. So it is something you definitely have to consider. I would use it as a tiebreaker. I wouldn't use it as like, I'm going to prop this guy over this guy who I like better because he has dual position. But if you're sitting there and you're stuck between two players, go with the guy who has that extra eligibility, because there will be a few occasions throughout the year where that is a difference maker.
Yeah, exactly. And are there any guys in that you're looking at, I guess, maybe early or even later on? Because I think there are some guys a little bit later on that provide this sort of value that you're kind of keeping your eye on, that like maybe they're like, oh, I really want this guy because they have the flexibility of this. And then also he's kind of a sleeper. Like, for example, when I'm looking at the first few rounds, like Matt Boldy kind of comes as a player that I would probably draft and elevate over maybe a couple guys because he has the left wing and right wing capabilities.
Yeah, you said it with Boldy. That was the one guy I was going to say too, because he fits everything I want on my team early on. He's got goal scoring upside. He likes to shoot the puck. He's someone that I think makes a lot of sense. And Nugent Hopkins too is another guy who I will take because he's got the dual position eligibility, center and the wing. I think he's right wing. I think he is right wing too, Nuge, if I'm not mistaken. I'll double check this too. I just want to make sure. I don't want to be lying to the good people watching. So, but Nugent Hopkins is another guy here who he's got that dual position eligibility, and I like him. He's got left wing, so he's also left wing Nugent. So I like that as well. If I can get a guy like him, because he's going to be attached to that really good Oilers power play, and there's a few players early on and later in drafts that is like I said, a tiebreaker when you're looking to split a tie between two guys.
Yeah, definitely. And, when we first had you on the show, we were doing the fantasy hockey rankings. We were both kind of in the same kind of hole on Nuge. I've pivoted a little bit away from Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. I think I'm staying away from him in drafts this year. I think obviously the power play is great and all, but I think 53 power points is a lot to rely on. And a guy whose shooting percentage went up, I think 6 or 7% from what we've generally seen it. And I just think Bouchard might get a little bit more time on the power play as maybe like the quarterback. Like I know Nuge played a little bit on front, but he's also the center on that line. And then who knows, maybe we see a Vander Kane, Connor Brown getting mixed in there too. So I'm not staying completely away from it, but definitely not necessarily drafting him at his ADP, which goes into our next kind of draft strategy as well. The last one, the best player available, and then pairing that with kind of the complementary draft strategy. And I like this one a lot. Taking the best player available, it kind of makes you work for your team a little bit harder because you definitely have to probably make some trades after the draft is done or maybe a couple weeks into the season. Because if you go heavy on one position, it's definitely an advantage because that means you definitely have some assets that you can move. And then this goes hand in hand with complementing your draft picks as well. Like if you take someone like Elias Peterson or Mitch Marner in the first 2 rounds, guys that are really skilled, you're going to want to look for a defenseman, obviously, especially in category leagues, but points leagues, I think it works as well. Like a defenseman like Mort Seider, who's getting a lot of hits, or like even a forward super later on, like Tanner Jeannot or something like that. So I know you mentioned the best player available is something you look at. Is this kind of one of the reasons why?
Yeah, it totally is, because you want to be trading from a position of strength in fantasy hockey. Otherwise, you're just kind of patching up. You're ripping the patch off of one hole to patch up another hole, and then you still need another patch because that hole's leaking now. So that's where it's good to draft the best player available, because then you can go, hey, look, my team I'm consistently winning the goals category every single week, but I need some more defensive points, right? Like my assists are down, or maybe I need some more power play points, or whatever it is. You can then move one of your high goal scorers and bring in someone else and make your team more well-rounded, because that's what you're looking to do in a categories league. So in a points league, especially, like it's a little bit easier to take best player available there because you're looking for one thing, and that's points. Like you just need to get guys who are going to rack up fantasy points for you. Where in a categories league, it's a little bit trickier because you need a well-balanced roster because every category is worth the same. So it is, to me, the best strategy just to take the best player available. Be mindful of where you are, like as far as positions go, and be mindful of where those tier drop-offs are in a draft, because that is a big thing too. Like if you're looking for a defenseman, and to me, in that draft that I did today, the kind of firewall, the last guy I wanted to take before I thought everything dropped was Bouchard. So I made sure to get Bouchard because I really didn't like a lot of the defensemen going after him. So be mindful of that too. Look position by position while you're sitting there in your draft and see, okay, like if I don't get this player, whether it's a goalie, defenseman, forward, whatever it is, I'm not going to be happy with who's going after him. Like there's a significant drop off, because that'll help you make your decision. And that does work into the best player available strategy as well, because you want to make sure that you're not missing out on a guy who is much better than the alternative options after him and later in your draft.
Yeah, definitely. I think defense are definitely a good way to think about that as well. You'll see them go before their ADP a lot of the time, especially those guys like Evan Bouchard and some of those guys who are going in the 4th, 5th, or 6th round as people try to kind of shore up their defensive unit before that, before the drop off. So before we go, Steve, is there any one last piece of advice you want to give fantasy hockey owners gearing up for their draft, or any strategy notes that we might have missed?
Trying to think. So we covered draft goals early because you're not going to find them later in your draft. When it comes to the hits and the block shots, that's the easiest position to supplement. I would say be mindful of, like you said, players in new situations. We kind of talked about that with goaltenders and playing in front of better defenses. That's always a big indicator of like an uptick in goaltending production for fantasy if the goalie situation upgrades. But also be mindful about players as well. Like a guy who's going really low in drafts, who I think had a really big teammate boost, is Tyler Toffoli. Like he's now he's probably going to start the year off with Jack Hughes. And that's something we like for fantasy. We're taking Jack Hughes in the 1st and 2nd round. And now you have this guy who's been a perennial 30 goal scorer playing with maybe the best center he's ever played with in his career. So, I would say, especially from offensive production standpoint, I think Hughes will probably be the best center he's played with. So just be mindful of everything that happened in the offseason, because new teammates will create new fantasy scenarios. A guy who's getting the opposite is David Pastrnak for the Boston Bruins, no longer playing with Patrice Bergeron. Pavel Zacha is a big downgrade from Bergeron to Zacha. So be mindful of those guys who are shifting teams and have new line mates.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. Don't go in your drafts cold. That's the worst possible thing you could do. Do a little bit of research before, even if it's 5 or 10 minutes before, get your mind right. Get ready to you want to win, you want to win your fantasy hockey draft. So yeah, definitely kind of go through this video right before your drafts and look at the different strategies. Obviously listen to things Steve said, because we've been doing this for a bit, Steve. So I think we can definitely give out some decent advice here and there.
Yeah, this isn't our first rodeo.
There we go.
We've been in the mocks for years, in the Yahoo fantasy trenches for years.
There we go. Okay, perfect. Please let me know what you guys thought of today's draft strategies. If there's any we missed or any other notes you guys want us to know, please fire them off in the comments. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.